We're going to try to cover these topics today and also give you a little opportunity to ask questions. So we're going to talk about the revenue sources, enrollment, and then further on tuition and fees, and then property taxes, and then how those processes work, and then instructional formula funding, and what are success points. Everybody wants to know that formula. And then insurance and retirement, and then we'll allow some time for questions. Sources of operating revenue. We used to call this a three-footed stool. The state appropriations, that's for core operations, used to be 8 elements of cost. Basically, that's what you use that for, your instructional programs, your administration. And property taxes were collected for maintenance and operation in your taxing district. And then your tuition and fees. Now, this is what's happened to us over the last 10-year period. You can see the blue line is the state appropriation there, and you can see the decline that has occurred. While community colleges have been increasing in enrollment, the reimbursement per student has gone down from the state. So now we're in a different mix, and we've had to increase tuition and, in some cases, taxes to take up that loss so that we can continue to operate. Now, that's going to vary a great deal by each institution, which I'm going to show you. But the mix is, about 20% now from the state of Texas, where I can remember, believe this or not, she said, I've been in this business 40 years, and I have, when we actually, I think no one remembers this but me, got 100% of our allocation for instruction from the state of Texas. But that's gone down as we've grown, as I said earlier. So this is just to give you a little bit of a mix of what happens with each of these colleges. You're looking at San Jacinto, Wharton, Clarendon, Tarrant, and then statewide. So you're looking at a larger college, mid-sized college, and a small college, just to give you an idea of how each college differs based upon their revenue streams from each of these sources. So in some cases, your tuition and fees are much higher because that particular district has a very small tax district. So they have had to go up on tuition and fees, and they, in other cases where they have larger tax district, they have been able to keep their tuition and fees lower. So each of the 50 community colleges is somewhat different. So as you're looking at your college and comparing it to the state, those are the kind of questions you might want to ask if you're a new board member. What's our tax district? Who do we serve? How do we serve out of district? Those sort of questions will come to mind when you're looking at this. Basically, just that we're all unique. If you look at the fall enrollments over the past 10 years, you can see that we peaked in about 2010 and 2011, but we're maintaining enrollment. It's a pretty steady enrollment. We usually have a higher enrollment when the economy is down. And believe it or not, that's when, of course, the state has less money to fund. Now, when the economy's good, our students typically work, and they don't come back to the college as much. But you can see that we've been very involved in the workforce because that has been somewhat stable over this past period. We don't see those ups and downs quite as much. Tuition and fees. We've done a really good job at trying to keep our tuitions down. Some of us had to go up. You saw the variance earlier in that, but we've done a really good job at trying to keep our in-district. That's in our tax district. Some of the new board members may want to ask that question. What does that mean? Well, that's within your taxing district. Typically, that's how that's explained. So if your taxpayers are paying you money, you're typically giving them a lower rate on tuition and fees. So you can see out of district has risen some over the period of time, but really out of state is where we are going up more. Some of us are having to go up on the out of district because we're providing more services there, and we just can't do it without additional monies if we don't have the tax monies. Now, if you look at the Gulf Coast, it varies a great deal, the in-district, the out-of-district. So those, again, are due to the fact that a number of these institutions have larger tax bases. Some don't, so some have had to rely on tuition and fees. Others have relied upon their tax base to support them. But if you look overall at us compared to universities, you can see that we're about a third the cost of a university. So community college is the best deal there really is for a student taking those first 2 years or taking a vocational program. It's really a great opportunity for your community and your parents. Our favorite subject, property tax. The one thing that I want you to take away from this is it's not so much that we have increased the amount of our property tax rate, it's the values have gone up. 70% of the tax value is in a community college within the state of Texas. So we've not gone up very much on the rates themselves, but the tax values have doubled in the past years. As I said, 70% of the state's property wealth is within a community college district. Value of property wealth in college has more than doubled, and it's increased statewide from 122%. But the tax rate, again, has not varied very much within a community college. We usually stay pretty close to that effective tax rate. Effective tax rate means that you get the same dollars in. So if your values go up, community colleges typically try to stay within that. They get the same dollar amount. So if your values go up, your rate would go down. You as a board would vote on that, whether you want to go outside that or not. And of course, there are statutes that require that you go through a process if you do take $1 more in taxes.
So I'm going to talk to you about the state process and how the state process is so important to community colleges, and just kind of walk you through what that process is. So you know about the state revenue sources. Largely, we are based on sales tax and other fees, and those revenue sources come together in putting together how the legislature needs to decide the state budget. From a community college standpoint, this is the process of how our budgeting process works in trying to put the request together for the state. The Texas Association of Community Colleges, which represents the 50 colleges, and the presidents, the CEOs, are part of that group. We have a legislative committee. That legislative committee is working right now to put together that agenda. And they're also working with the CAT group, the Community College Association of Texas Trustees. We will have a meeting within 2 weeks between the Legislative Committee of TAC and CAT to make sure we're in alignment as we've been working through our agenda. So we pulled together those agenda items, and we are looking at our funding request and what other priorities there needs to be from TAC. And then we put together also our legislative appropriation request. That request is what gets sent into the Legislative Budget Board. Each community college does an LAR, which is what we call it, and but it's really in alignment with the instructions that we get, and then how the TAC request is coming out. And the LBB, the Legislative Budget Board, once they get all those LARs in, they also hold budget hearings. From those LARs, and it's not just ours, it's universities, it's any other state entity, they put together the budget request from the LBB. As TAC, community colleges are working on our agenda. It really is trying to make sure we're being collaborative and we're all understanding the issues and having the communication. And so it is all of us working together to come up with a comprehensive agenda. And I also want to stress the importance of working with the coordinating board. So right now, the coordinating board has a community college and technical college formula advisory committee. That group is also meeting. That's made up of CEOs and other representatives of community colleges. Texas State Technical College is part of that. And they're putting together a recommendation back to the coordinating board. And we're really trying to make sure all of that is in alignment, and that's around funding. The other thing that's coming out of the TAC legislative requests or priorities are what are the other items that need to be looked at as a priority. Dual credit is one of those issues we're looking at right now. Workforce training, what needs to happen there. Are there new dollars needed for financial aid? So we're going through what are all those areas to be considered right now. Transfer, that's always a hot one. And so that'll be coming forward also. And again, once we submit our LARs, then it goes into the LBB and some kind of, based on the general revenue number from the comptroller, then it'll come together with the LBB's recommendation and also the recommendations from Senate Finance and House Finance. And so that is how all those pieces come together. Once the Senate files their finance bill and the House files their bill, then there's conference hearings. And that's really, so this starts January of 19, and that's when things start moving. And the conference committees are where there tries to be some kind of merger of requests and testimonies happening through that. It's a long process, and I know if you've been part of the board, you know your CEOs are, and your legislative representatives are really active in Austin during that time. And I can tell you the involvement of trustees in that process is critical. Kat has been absolutely a critical component of our testimonies. It means a lot more to legislators to have a trustee at the table testifying, giving their perspective as an elected official. And so our relationship with the trustees around that agenda and making sure that we're all in alignment, and how that even aligns with regular meetings throughout the session. So as things are changing, we're again all in alignment is critical. So if you're not involved with CAT, I hope you will be. That is, again, a really important organization for us as we move into the legislative session. So as far as state funding for community colleges, Betty talked about how state funding has been reduced in our models for funding and how we balance the budget. But it's still an important part, and we've got to understand the components. So we've had changes. You can see back when community colleges first got started in the 40s up until the 1973, we were funded on a full-time student equivalent, and then it moved into contact hours from 74 to 2013. Contact hours are basically enrollment, and I'll tell you how those are calculated in a little bit. And then in 2014, we had a change. And it was really community colleges coming to the table and asking for this change. One of the things in the session before, we were really hearing about the move for performance funding. And we decided we were going to get proactive and we were going to design a performance funding system. We didn't want the legislature to decide it for us. And so this was the model that we came forward with the recommendation. And at that point, we asked for a core operation, $1 million an institution over a biennium. So if you're an Alamo, you get $1 million, and if you're a Wharton, you get $1 million. And that's for the 2 years. And we looked at that as we had to have fixed costs, some operational costs that needed to be funded. No matter if you're a large institution or a small institution, you need a CEO, you need a registrar. And so we just put with what could be a recommendation around this base. And then we took the next piece and we said with the rest of the funding, we wanted a 90-10 split. 90 for contact hours or enrollment and 10% for student success points. And that was the model that went forward. And so you can see how the allocations happened. We went in with a request for that session of $1.96 billion. We ended up getting $1.81 billion. So it wasn't what we asked for, but there was a lot of negotiation through the process. And in the end, that was the allocation. And then we went into the 2016-17 funding year. And again, a little bit of a reduction, 1.75. And there was also a hold harmless for institutions, a small number who had declines. But again, you can see the breakdown. We maintained the same model going into 2016-17. This last session, we asked that student success points and contact hours be decoupled, meaning we didn't want this link anymore of the 90-10 split. We felt that was hurting us because we were actually seeing a greater increase in the student success points. And so if you look in the student success point box, it actually represents 10.6% of the contact hour and student success point funding. So a little bit of an increase there. And core operations actually went up this legislative session. So now it's 1.36 million per institution over the 2 years versus the million before. As the community colleges were putting together our legislative agenda, it was July before the session opened, we had a much larger request on the table than what came forward. And based on what we were hearing from our legislators and what we were hearing from, the governor and the lieutenant governor, we knew we needed to revise that request. So we made modifications before we put together the final recommendation that went to the legislature in January. We also came forward with a commitment that our top priority was going to be core funding. And core funding was most important to our smaller colleges. And we felt that we really wanted to make that the priority. And in all honesty, from a large college perspective, that was not a very good benefit for us. But again, we looked at this, what was the needed for the entire membership. And if you look at your institution around where core funding has an impact, for me, it's about 1% of my total funding from the state. For a college like Wharton, it's 5%. For smaller colleges, even than Wharton, it could be 7 to 8%. And so you really have to look at those components of it. And so we made that as the priority, and that was really what got approved in the final recommendation from the legislature. So what do those funding components mean? So on the instructional side, the contact hour piece, which makes up about 89% of the funding that we get, it's a contact hour. It's enrollment. It's how many students we have in a class. And this just walks you through what a contact hour is. You got a 3-credit hour government course. They meet 1.5 hours a week, 2 times a week. They meet 16 weeks. That calculates out to 48 contact hours per student. And then you have 20 students in the class, so that's 960 contact hours. You add that up for all your sections, and that's your contact hours. That's your enrollment. And that really, so if it's an 8-week course, you have revisions around that. If it's a distance learning course, we calculate that. But that really is how the contact hours are calculated. And while we're all focused on student success, we know we can't forget the enrollment. We know the student success piece helps drive enrollment. We're all out there recruiting. We're trying to build this number, but we're also trying to manage the student success side of it too. But this contact hour funding is important to us. If you looked at the instructional dollars, the blue is the instructional dollars we get, and so you can see it's the major piece of what we get and why it is important. Another important piece about the contact hours, as Betty mentioned, we get a contact hour funding then. And the contact hour funding, I think this last year was about $3.05 a contact hour. And that's across programs, it varies. We do a cost allocation by program that we send into the state. You can look at what your cost is by program. Some programs, health sciences, are very expensive. A math course is less expensive, but the average is about $3.05 a contact hour. This is really an important slide because it takes and looks at this formula funding, this instructional piece, a little differently. It takes all the instructional dollars, and it looks at it from a full-time student equivalent. 75% of our students are part-time, at least in my institution. And so how do I start allocating this back into something that we can have a conversation with across the state that is meaningful for all institutions? And a full-time student equivalent is So you can see the funding per full-time student equivalent is $1,884 across the state. We used to be at $2,115. Danny from Wharton actually asked for this schedule when we were out meeting with legislators, because it really told the story that our funding is reduced. And you can show them dollar amounts, and then you get into, well, where's your enrollment? But this gives it to you on a weighted average that legislators can understand. And so we have a longer history of this, but I think this one gives you some really important information, and TAC will put that into another handout as we're working on our legislative agenda this year. Student success points was the new part of the agenda, and on student success points, when we pulled that together, we had institutional research people, registrars, finance people, and presidents, and we looked at models across the country of what are the different performance management systems that are out there, and how do we use the system that best fits Texas and what we do. And so what we designed was we wanted a 3-year rolling average. We didn't want quirky things to hurt the system, and so the 3-year rolling average helped with that. We wanted institutions to compete among themselves, so it was me competing against myself on how my student success points were doing. It was also a matter of trying to show progression for everything that we do within our mission, from developmental education to graduation and transfer. And then knowing that there were also things we wanted to add in the future. And so the student success points model, the blue lines are the points we have in place right now. The pieces at the bottom that don't have a blue line to it are things we'd like to add in the future, such as ABE, Adult Basic Education, and ESL, GED, high demand workforce, or employment. The reason those aren't on there, as far as the GED and the ABE, there's not a lot of dollars for those areas to be funded, and there's weaknesses in the system around how you're really meeting needs. There's also, and then on the high demand workforce employment, it's difficult data to get across the state, and there's no really great reporting system. The other thing we wanted is consistency, where we're all reporting the same data, and that there's a system that's gathering it. All these other points, all community colleges submit that information into the coordinating board. We went back as we were designing the system, and we made sure how it referenced back to reports that were being submitted to the coordinating board. We had a data dictionary, and if institutions were not reporting something properly, they at least knew where they needed to go and get the information now. So you can see when you complete developmental education, you get a point for completing math, you get a point for completing reading and writing. As you pass through your first college credit, there's a point, 15 credit hours, 30 credit hours. Degrees and certificates are 2 points. There's some STEM fields that are 2.25 points, and then and certificates earn points also. And then for transfer, it's 2 points. And so this is being measured for all community colleges. So from a funding standpoint, we went into the first session with student success points, and the funding was $185 a point. For the next session, it went down to $173. And I'll tell you, that was very disappointing to us. So you take, you get a little aggressive on a system, you put together what you think the legislature wants, and then they don't fund the success. And from a CEO standpoint, as you're pushing a student success agenda at your college, they kind of question your credibility when now you get a reduction in the funding. And so this is something that's been an issue for us, is how do you mash up or mix up those things so it really makes sense. And then this last session, we're at $172 a point. Now the coordinating board went in asking for, I think it was over $210 a point for us, which was great. We went in asking for $185, and the first proposal that came out of the legislature gave us $166. And so to get back to $172, we thought was a win, and it really was, because community colleges did get an increase in funding this past session when a lot of areas didn't. But again, for our next session, student success points is really an area we're going to focus on. So what's happening with student success points? The 83rd session, we had about 929,000 points across the state. You can see we had a 5% increase. And then now we're at 1,049,000. So in that period, a 12% increase. At my college, we report out to the board on our student success point progression. So we know when we started the student success point system, we had about 37,000 points we were generating a year. The past year, we were at about 49,000. We look at each of the pieces of it. And if you look across the state, from where we went into student success points to where we are now, we've had a 22% increase in the number of points being earned in completing the first college credit. We've had a 50% increase in the number of credentials being awarded with points. And then we've had a 30% increase in the number of points awarded for transfer. So are we doing a better job? I believe we are, because it's a real focus for all of us. I think we've always done a great job, though, but now you focus on what the priorities become. But I also think reporting is much different. You know, we have really cleaned up reporting issues, but it is that the institutions are totally focused on this, and it's throughout your institution, is a real alignment around this work. So I mentioned that for this next legislative session, while we're still working through the agenda, we see student success points being a greater focus. And sometimes that makes institutions nervous, presidents nervous, and as a trustee, it might make you nervous. But I want you to see this. So for the year, the last biennium, we had a 7% increase in student success points. Of the 50 community colleges, 43 of them had increases in student success points. So 7 had declines. If you look at contact hours across the state went down 0.7%, but 27 community colleges had declines in contact hours. And so with having a system that is split between contact hours and student success points, and now focusing more on student success points as we make our next request, I think you're going to see more institutions benefiting from this, because we have more control over the student success points as we continue to manage our systems. And so while we're always nervous about it, you know, when you start making these requests, the numbers indicate that there's a different relationship here. And so how do we try to benefit from both of those and not have the significant fluctuations that we've had in the past with just an enrollment-driven revenue system? So now I'm going to turn it back to Betty, and she's going to talk to you about benefits. What?
Yeah, the great group insurance, and then we'll talk about that last GASB 68 in just a moment. This gives you an evolution of our group health insurance. So I'm just going to go through it. Prior to 1978, each institution actually bid their own insurance package. I did that when I first started with community colleges, so every one of us was out there trying to get the best we could based upon our history with our employees. So following that, though, and at that time the state didn't give us anything for that, by the way, but in 78 to 1991, the state provided a health insurance appropriation for each eligible employee. Now, the way that was determined, you turned in a census date information. If you employed people after that census date, they would not fund that typically unless they did another census date, which at times they did to help us out. But it was that census date information. So if you had 100 employees on that census date and you had this big surge of employees of 25, you may not be able to count those, and then you may not get the state appropriations. When there was extra money, they did that for us in support of the community colleges. But at the 72nd legislature, we were brought into the ERS system. All community college employees were in the state's health insurance plan. Now that was done primarily to add to that pool. Community colleges were seen as a benefit to the state to bring into that system. The larger the pool, the better the rate the state could get. So it was seen as a benefit to the state to do that. And of course, as a community college, we felt that was important for us, for our sustainability, to be part of that system. Because when you're out there trying to find insurance on your own, it is very, very difficult. If you're a small institution particularly, and you have one or two people or three that have a major illness, then your rates go sky high. So if you're in a bigger pool, that's better for you, and it was better for the state. So that's what happened there. In 2003, the 78th legislature, though, removed all physical plant employees. Physical plant costs are to be borne out of your tax base. So that was the logic behind that. If we're paying that, we're actually paying a portion that we shouldn't be funding from state appropriations. That was the logic. A lot of discussion went on over that. So then we had to take those people out of our census information, and we had to cover those individuals ourselves. In addition to that, if you have a grant area, that has to be paid for out of the grant. Sometimes you don't realize that. It's great to get grant positions, but you have to budget in those costs as well. From 2005 to 2013, it became very contentious, and that word is mild to say the least. Proportionality. Does anybody remember that term? I don't even like to talk about it. But proportionality kind of hit the scene as you're paying more and more of your costs for instruction out of your local taxes or your tuition and fees. So we're not funding that. So our proportion from the state, this is the logic, should go down. We shouldn't be paying the same proportion for those individuals. Well, if you look at that as a long term, the less the state funds in that area and in other areas, the more your local amount goes up. So it would be declining until you really might not even have any health support from the state. So it was every session, it was an issue. We didn't even get to talk about the work we were doing. It primarily became an issue over proportionality. So we felt very strongly that we needed to work toward a consensus that the legislature could help support, and that be taken out and put into statute so we didn't have to go every time to the legislature and make that point again. So in 2013, we went with a 50-50 cost sharing. Now, for some of us, we felt we'd love to have had more, but that was a discussion with the Senate Finance Committee. There's several in this room that were part of that, and it came down to that's what we're going to support you with. And so at the first, it was a little difficult for some of us to rationalize that, but as we go forward, you're going to see it has benefited us. So in this last session, that discussion did not occur. This is an appropriation you get beyond your formula funding. So it just came out that we were given the 50%. So we didn't have to have that kind of discussion again, and we actually got an increase where we might have gotten a decrease otherwise. So this worked very well for us at that point in time. I'm going to wait just a minute. This is my favorite topic that we're fixing to pursue here. The other thing that is a concern with the health insurance is, again, that census date, when they take that census date. So you need to understand, and your CEO can explain that to you further. But anytime that the state doesn't allow you to take a census date, that will be critical for community colleges. So that's another area that we have to be cognizant of. Now let's look at This is a new accounting rule. Now, while this does not affect your revenue, basically, but if you have retirement pensions with TRS, this is a GASB 68 rule, Governmental Accounting Standards Board, that we have to book the liability for those pensions. And you had to book them this last year, 2015, no, excuse me. So what does that do to your fund balance? It's money that you can't use. It's a liability that you have to hold. It's an escrow in case it has to be funded to the state. We have to hold that amount. Now, for my college, it's around $6 million. For some of the very large colleges, it's a very, very significant dollar amount. You can't use it. It might have been, I didn't do that, whatever that is, turned. It's money that you might have had that you put up for your reserve. Most of us like to have 3 to 4 months in reserve in case there's an emergency. That may have taken away from that, but it takes away from your bottom line as far as your presentation on your financials. If you're going out for bonds, that may be an issue. Some of you may have already had that issue. I'm sure most of you have already been presented with your audit for this year, and that's in there, and it does increase or decrease based upon the investments that are being done with the monies that are being held. We don't hold those monies that TRS holds. We only hold the liability. So it's not a cash issue. We're not giving them back cash, but we have to hold it. So it does diminish the amount that you might have available to do other things. It also may put your institution in the red, so to speak. While it's not really a cash loss, it may show up as that. So the next issue that I want to mention is that the likelihood is that we will be facing the same thing with health insurance. So that's a new thing that's coming up. So you'll be hearing your CEO and your CFO talk about that particular issue as well. So that's another liability that's going to have to be booked. And from what I'm hearing already, it's a more significant dollar amount than your TRS pension liability. That's what we aim for. Every CEO in here has to remind ourselves on occasion that that's what we're here for, and we all do. So we wanted to open it up for questions to see if you had some, if we could clarify some things. Or if we don't know, we'll look to our colleagues that are in this room with us. So Brenda and I both are available for questions, if you have any. Questions? Yes. Okay. It's not just the state of Texas. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board is a national requirement. Yeah, so it's across the United States. It's the assurance that that particular liability is booked somewhere. It's not just floating around that people don't realize it. And Brenda can probably speak better to that than I can, but...
Well, she's exactly right. And so the Government Accounting Standards Boards, they look at what are the issues out there, where do they feel there's gaps in the financial statements. Accountants and users of financial statements can make comments as these rules are coming out, just like when the coordinating board has a rule, we make comments. On the Government Accounting Standards Board, it is just one to try to, again, look at presentation and transparency of financial statements and where liabilities are. There was no way to stop at this issue with the health benefits. It's going to be pretty much the same way. And so when a new government accounting standards happens like that, there are the TAC auditor, the business offices, they're called the TACBO, and the business officers and the state work on what the presentation should be on our financial statements to try to make sure there's consistency. But it is There's not a whole lot you can do when this comes out of the standards boards. And you have to maintain, you have to book this to be in compliance. If you don't, you won't get a clean audit opinion. So I couldn't hear. Yes. What is it? Yes, it affects it. Do we have time? We have several hands, are we? No? She said we don't have time. Come up and we'll talk to you, okay? All right. Thank you all. We appreciate your time.